So, after this session of musical chairs, good evening, and I'm delighted to welcome you and all, and especially our speakers, Sarah Churchwell and Kevin Jackson, as well as Nicolette Jones, who's chairing this session, to the Charleston Festival. No one could have failed to notice that The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, is flavour of the month. Tonight's speakers look at Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece, as well as the age in which it was written, from different but overlapping perspectives. Sarah Churchwell is Professor of American Literature and the Public Understanding of the Humanities at the University of East Anglia. Her new book, Careless People, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby, is a wonderful piece of literary detective work focusing on 1922, when Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda returned from Europe to New York and the seeds of the novel were sown. Kevin Jackson has written countless books and articles, primarily on film, photography, modern art, literature, and cultural history, for journals such as The New Yorker, Granta, and The Guardian. He's lectured at the National Film Theatre, the Royal College of Art, and the V&A, and is a regular broadcaster for radio and TV. His book, which we're considering this evening, Constellation of Genius, 1922, Modernism, Year One, pinpoints 1922 as the year in which a revolutionary movement in literature, art, music and dance began. And of course, this encompasses the genesis of The Great Gatsby. Nicolette Jones is a writer, journalist and author specialising in literature and the arts. Now, Sarah and Kevin will each talk for a short while, a very short while, individually about their books, and then they're going to have a conversation, and we can eavesdrop on that conversation. I'll hand over to Sarah.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Sorry. Yes, thank you all for coming and for applauding. That's very nice of you. We've been asked to just say a few words about our books so that you have some sense of what it is that we're talking about before we actually jump in. But I think it's something, Kevin and I have both been looking forward to this, because we've had the privilege of speaking together before about the 1920s and about Gatsby on kind of peripheral ways. But it really is extraordinary, I think, that our books, which have come out within about 6 months of each other, really have a very, very strong overlap. And I know I hugely enjoyed reading Kevin's book, because it's as if Kevin covers the breadth of 1922 in a global context. And I take 4 months at the end of 1922 in New York and dive as deep into that period as I can. And I really think that putting them together is I certainly found Kevin's book immensely valuable. So there's a sense here in which 1922 is the crux of the tale. For me, that came about because Scott Fitzgerald sets The Great Gatsby in 1922, and it's the date that the only specific date that he gives in the novel is July 5th, 1922, which, of course, for any Americans in the audience, we know is the day after.
You're hungover.
Exactly. The day after Independence Day, and this is a date that literary critics have interpreted as meaning that the hope for America's future is already in the past. That it's a kind of belated. There's a feeling of belatedness in the book, and that's why Fitzgerald chooses July 5th. And there's been a lot of focus on July 5th, but not very much focus on 1922. And what focus there has been on 1922 was on the important fact, which Kevin, I'm sure, will say more about, that T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, was published at the end of 1922, and Fitzgerald is certainly picking up on and paying an homage to The Wasteland at various points in The Great Gatsby as well. But it turns out that 1922 is also at the end of 1922 is also the time at which Scott and Zelda returned to New York and began the parties that would inspire The Great Gatsby. So there's a biographical element to this as well, and a historical element. This is what Scott and Zelda were actually doing, and they're going off to New York and they're kicking off these parties. And I started looking for the exact date that they were that they came back. And I found as I read through all these biographies and all the scholarship, and of course it will amaze all of you, that The Great Gatsby has been somewhat picked over by literary critics. I mean, there is a lot of stuff out there and a lot of work has been done, and a lot of it, of course, very brilliant and very important work. So I thought, well, somebody will have worked out exactly what date it was. And they were, one of the important things is that Scott and Zelda were already very famous, so they're already in the public eye. So I thought it's not going to be very hard to find out exactly what date they came back when two famous people returned to New York. Turns out it was actually very, very hard to do. It took me about 4 years. And I knew roughly when it was. And enough books had sort of established it that it was late September 1922, although actually most of them say early October, but I knew that wasn't right because of a letter that Fitzgerald's friend Edmund Wilson wrote. So there are certain ways that we could date it within about a week, but that was still pretty vague, and I thought I really want to know when it all kicked off. So I started reading around it, and I discovered that in that week where they were roughly coming back, there was also this massive murder mystery that was happening just outside of New York in a town called New Brunswick. Now, for anybody who knows what we call the tri-state area, which is the New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, New Brunswick is just next door to Princeton, which is where Fitzgerald did his undergraduate degree, and where he and Zelda, it's very close to New York, and they were still going back to party in Princeton. So the fact that there was this murder in New Brunswick, it actually had great proximity, and there was a sense that this was actually happening right there on his doorstep. And it actually was a massive national murder mystery because, well, for all kinds of reasons. But it became one of the most famous cases of the 1920s, but has now today been almost completely forgotten. And that also happened in exactly the same week when they were starting to come back. It was when this murder mystery kicked off, and then it ran through the rest of 1922. And so I dug around a little bit, and I found that a couple of people had written very, very short and kind of cursory examinations of the possible relationship of this murder mystery to The Great Gatsby, but they really hadn't delved very far, and I think they hadn't tried to delve very far. They had just sort of noticed a few parallels. And you know those scholarly articles that aren't really articles, they call them like notes and queries, they're like a page and a half, and they just sort of say, well, here's something interesting, and I don't really have anything to make of it, and so I'm done now. So they kind of noted that there was maybe these shared details, and then didn't really try to do anything more with them. So all of that is happening within this crux of this week in 1922, and I just started thinking about it and thinking about the fact that Fitzgerald chose to set his book in 1922. And the more that I read about this murder mystery, it also then took me into the newspapers, of course, because that was how I started recreating it. And I started to discover all of this stuff in the papers that it seemed to me had somehow percolated its way into The Great Gatsby in ways that I don't think had been sufficiently appreciated. So what I ended up doing was trying to write a book that would be certainly not an academic book, although it is informed by scholarship, but that would be a story that would tell the story of Scott and Zelda returning to New York and parallel it with this murder mystery that's happening at exactly the same time, and try then to weave those two together into an understanding of The Great Gatsby and see if those two stories could open up what we know about the novel. So the book kind of tries to take those three strands and sort of plait them together and see if we can understand The Great Gatsby better by doing so.
Perfect. That's a great summary of the main points. We will come to more of it later and unpick it a bit more. But now, Kevin, if you can tell us a little bit about the essence of your book.
Sarah and I didn't know each other until quite recently, and we're becoming friends as a result of occasions like this. But about a year or so ago, somebody phoned me up and said, have you heard the Today programme? And I said no, because I don't listen to Radio 4, I listen to Radio 3. And they said, there's somebody on there who's talking about 1922 as being the most important year in literature, in modern literature, and my heart went through the floor. I thought, because if you were working on
the same reaction when I heard about your book.
If you're working on a book that has taken quite a long time, your greatest dread in the world is someone's going to bring out another book and a better one about 6 weeks before yours, and you'll be obliterated. Well, fortunately, it turns out that our books are complementary rather than competitive.
Yin and yang.
Very much so, and delightfully so. And as there's something about Samuel Johnson says something about the extraordinary hypocrisy of authors being polite to each other. But Sarah's book is fabulous. Sarah's book is completely fabulous. It's a brilliant read. It's told me enormous numbers of things about something I thought I knew a lot about, and obviously didn't. They're very different books, I think. Yours is more of a compelling single narrative because it has lead characters. My book has about 200 lead characters, so it doesn't have that kind of concentration and focus, and it also ranges around pretty much the entire planet, including Antarctica. And certainly there's lots to do with Russia, and there's a bit to do with China, not too much, and there's lots and lots and lots to do with Paris and London. So it's very much, it's a broader canvas, but therefore perhaps a more shallow canvas, I don't know. Anyway, we'll see. I'm going to say just one quick thing about why, the motive for doing it, and one quick thing about the how, the method I used, particularly as the latter is the thing that the people who don't like my book seem to have disliked most about it. The personal origin of it is a very straightforward one. I was 17 years old, and I was doing an appallingly boring summer job in the city of London, working... it's a highly technical job, pinning bits of white paper to bits of green paper. And the only thing that made it bearable was the fact that I'd already read The Wasteland at this time, thanks to good school teachers. And I knew that T.S. Eliot, when he wrote The Wasteland, was drudging at Lloyd's Bank in the city of London. And I thought, well, okay, this is rubbish, but perhaps I'll write a masterpiece one day. And then in the evening, to escape from the profound tedium of pinning bits of paper to other bits of paper, I was reading lots of novels. And it was the first summer that I read Ulysses. This is a long time ago. This is almost 12 years ago. And I noticed when I was reading these things that the extraordinary fact, which about 5 million other people have also noticed, that both The Wasteland and Ulysses were published in the same year, 1922. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a coincidence. Wonder if there's anything in that. And then I put that aside for a while. Was lucky enough to go to university. And in my second year at university, began to read a lot about the American poet Ezra Pound, about whom I have profoundly mixed feelings. Because on one hand, I think in his early days, he was absolutely wonderful guy, a fantastic promoter, a talent in his own right, and a wonderful recognizer and promoter of talents in others, particularly Eliot and Joyce. And I realised that one of the reasons why they were both published in the same year is that Pound was this fantastically generous and almost heroically self-sacrificing midwife of their talents and publicist for their achievements. And one of the reasons why they both appeared in 1922 is because it took Pound about 7 years to coach them out of nothingness and basically fundamental obscurity into the public arena. So there was an answer. And then as the years go by, I began to ask myself a very simple question, which is simply, number one, well, a couple of questions. One was, what did it feel like to read those books, which were so radically new and strange? I mean, now they're classics, and we find them, I found them at the age of 17, thanks to the generation, the labours of generation before me. I didn't find them particularly hard. I found them fantastically sexy and exciting. For me, I listened to a lot of rock music at the time. For me, they were as exciting as the latest album by, dare I say, Led Zeppelin. There was that kind of excitement I felt about Ulysses and The Wasteland. And I wanted simply to reconstruct what the world was like when they were new, and to ask what else was going on the other arts and in the sciences and in political life and in social life and in cultural life in the year 1922. What was that year like that produced these two works which remain, as I say, perhaps tastefully, they are the twin towers of modern literature. They remain uncontestedly the greatest English language poem of the 20th century, the greatest English novel of the 20th century, Parquet, Great Gatsby. And the book, therefore, its format is simple. It is a day-by-day account of what was happening on every day in the year 1922, using Eliot and Pound and Joyce as the main characters, but then spinning out around the planet to find out what else was happening as these books were being developed and being published. End of story. Thank you.
The how?
Beginning of story.
You said the how.
That's the how.
The how. Well, the how is really
day
the day by day. Really,
Oh,
it's that the structure. I'm one of those writers who can't write until they have an underlying structure, which is usually numerological. So I've done books based on the number 26, and I've done books based on 10, and so on and so forth. And this one is based on, obviously, I tried to make it based on 365. In fact, I don't make exactly every day. There were some days where just nothing happened. That was anywhere. Today, nothing happened, or nothing of significance to my tale. But it's a 12-part structure. It's 12 months broken down into most of the days of each month, and it simply tells you what was happening, and some of the events are enormous, like wars or revolutions or inventions, and some are incredibly trivial, like somebody complaining that they don't have enough money to pay the gas bill. So it tries to, I tried to introduce variety and to have a kind of musical structure to it, whereby every chapter will be approximately the same length, but it will tackle different subjects from around the world. And so you have everything from the weird and remarkable fact that three of the greatest 20th century Spanish artists, Buñuel, Salvador Dalí, and Federico García Lorca, were all at the same university at exactly the same time in 1922.
And friends,
things
which
like
I
that
didn't know
were,
until
and
I
were
read
great
your book.
friends. Yeah, we were enormous friends. So it produced an enormous number of surprises for me, and it was for that reason a kind of an adventure to write.
Great. Well, that's a fantastic summary too. And what we will do is come back to all of the themes that have just been introduced. But I'm afraid, since we are talking about the big Great Gatsby moment, I am going to begin by asking a bit about what you thought of the Baz Luhrmann film. Obviously, not only is the film out at the moment, but also the ballet, the Northern Ballet at Sadler's Wells, is doing a performance of the Great Gatsby. But tell us, what did you think? Does it work? I know that you said, I've heard you say, Sarah, that one of the misinterpretations of the Great Gatsby is that it's one of the great love stories. It's a kind of Romeo and Juliet in which they are star-crossed lovers thwarted by circumstance, and that's what the movies tend to make of it. There was a film in 1946 with Alan Ladd. 49 with Alan Ladd. There was obviously the Redford movie. There was Toby Stevens' TV adaptation. Tended to take this stand that it's all about Gatsby and Daisy being madly in love. But actually, when you read the book, of course, it's a story about a disillusioned, or rather a man with a delusion and unrealistic sense of the possibility of going back to his own past, who is in love with a woman who doesn't really deserve to be loved, careless people. She belongs to the class of careless people who will let people do damage around them. Now, Luhrmann's take doesn't quite sort this out, again, I assume. Tell us what you think.
Do you want me to?
Yeah,
you go, and then...
Yeah, I think that in fact, in the last session, there was a gentleman who asked a question about the Sadler's Wells, or started with the Sadler's Wells Gatsby. I don't know if he's still here, but I saw that last week as well, and it did exactly the same thing. So it doesn't even have to be a cinematic adaptation. I also saw the stage adaptations last year that were in London. There were two. There was one at the music hall, one in a pub. There was, of course, the reading of Gats, which is the only one that's a little bit different, the 7-hour reading of the novel, which, funnily enough, accurately portrayed the novel because it was reading it. But it's the only one that ever has. Yes, and what I think they all have in common is this apparent tremendous need for this to be a story of star-crossed lovers. But it doesn't make sense as a story of star-crossed lovers because Daisy has tons of money and Gatsby has tons of money, and it's an era in which divorce is possible, and so there is zero reason why, if they were madly in love with each other, they couldn't just run off and live happily ever after on his ill-gotten gains, and that would all be fine. And so it just doesn't actually make any sense. There has to be something else that's stopping them. And when you go to the novel, it turns out that what's stopping them is that Daisy doesn't want to. She just doesn't want to, for all kinds of reasons we can talk about if people want to. When you say that Gatsby is suffering under a delusion, I think that's absolutely right. Although I don't like to use the word suffering. That makes it sound like I'm medicalizing him, and I certainly don't want to do that. But he's deluded. He is deluded. And I've actually said before, and this tends to make my students and audiences sometimes come up a little bit short, but if you think about it, Gatsby's a stalker. That's what he is. Mm-hmm. He has a girlfriend who turns him down, and for 5 years he is obsessed with getting her back, to the point where he buys a house as close to her as he can get. He's like this creepy neighbor who's right there, and he shows Nick Carraway the clippings of her that he's been saving. And I always think so he's been like cutting out all the pictures of her from the newspapers that he can find. And I always think if this were a different story, that he would be the serial killer with that little cave of the photographs of Daisy, where you'd open it up and you'd think, oh my God, this guy's completely mad. But what I think is so absolutely brilliant about the novel, and what I think Luhrmann gets wrong, in Luhrmann's defense, every other adapter has also always gotten wrong. What's so brilliant about the novel is that only Tom Buchanan would look at Gatsby that way. And Tom Buchanan is so cynical and so repellent that we don't want to have anything to do with his point of view. And so what Fitzgerald does very, very cleverly is make us want to be the romantics. We want to see it from Gatsby's point of view. We want to believe that Daisy is right, or Daisy loves him too, and that he's right. And I think that's why so many people fall for it. But when you actually look at what happens in the novel, the whole tragedy, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, I hope I'm not. It doesn't,
Hamlet dies.
It doesn't work out well. And that's the other thing, right, that people say to me is, it's the great American success story. No, it's not. It's a failure story. Gatsby ends up dead in a swimming pool. It does not go well.
Spoiler.
Yeah, no, sorry.
She's kidding.
Yeah, exactly. It all works out fine. So the thing about Luhrmann, it seems to me, is that what he did was he keeps saying in the interviews and things that it's historically very accurate. And I think Kevin and I would have to, as the people who've just spent, how many years did you spend researching your book?
I don't want to talk about it.
Exactly. I spent 4.5 doing mine, and also years and years of reading around Gatsby before that. And the one thing I will say definitively about that film is it is not historically accurate. It has zero to do with 1922, but it is a very, very interesting take on 2013, I think. And it is. It's a film about today. I don't think it's aware of that, but it's nonetheless an interesting film about today. I think it holds a mirror up to us. And I think it's a film about our myths about the novel, not about the novel. And it does that very, very well. Again, I think unwittingly, but it does it very, very well.
You've said it's good on bombast and short on nuance, Kevin.
Did I say that?
You did.
What a genius I had last week.
I thought it was good. Tell us what you think.
Essentially, I expected to find it emetic, and I merely found it kind of, unengaging. I mean, the thing is that it's a simple equation. I think the more you care about the book, the more you'll hate the film. The less you know about it, the more you'll think it's quite entertaining. I mean, the crucial. I don't know whether any other critic has said this because I've not read any of the other reviews, but it seems to me that there's a very simple allegory to be told about this film, which is that essentially Luhrmann is Gatsby.
Absolutely.
Luhrmann is spendthrift, extravagant, vulgar, thoughtless, in love with surface glamour, and that's what the film is.
Absolutely, buys into it absolutely and completely.
And the notion that we have meant to have any kind of distance from this sort of from this spendthrift show-offery is entirely absent from the film.
Yeah, it's anathema to him. So there's a great bit at the end that I thought was really representative, in which, as many of you will remember, at the end of the novel, just before Nick gives his famous, this incredibly famous panegyric to America, he says... Which they cut. They always cut, but at least they kept a little bit of it. So they did a bit about the past, because it thinks it is a film about history and time, and so they keep the very, very last lines of the novel. But I have yet to see an adaptation that actually did anything with the stuff about America, because it's incredibly hard to... you've got to have a great actor who can make that sound natural and do that as a voiceover, who's going to do this whole thing about the meaning of America. But of course, that's where much of the meaning of the novel resides. So if you lose that, you kind of lose a lot of what's happening in the book.
And I think Tobey Maguire is far too lightweight to carry.
Well, I was going to say, Kevin, what do you think about the framing device that Luhrmann introduced, in which Nick Carraway is actually in rehab? And so it's obviously a way of trying to deal with the notion of an unreliable narrator, but you make him... Well, I think
my feeling about it as watching it isn't a bad per se. Intrinsically, it's not a bad idea. I mean, for those of you who've not seen it yet, this isn't much of a spoiler. The basic idea is they sort of Luhrmann kind of conflates Carraway and the real-life Fitzgerald at some future point in his life where he's said to be suffering from morbid alcoholism, depression, rage, blah, 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 blah. So the film is conducted as a series of therapeutic texts that Carraway produces for his therapist or for his doctor. And it opens up the possibility, again, not an entirely uninteresting one, although not followed through by the film, that the entire thing is a delusion. The entire thing is a fantasy that he's experienced as a result of complete mental collapse. But the problem is, so fundamentally not in itself a bad idea. The problem with it, at least as far as I'm concerned, is number one, Tobey Maguire just doesn't have the kind of gravitas to carry a role like that. And number two, although the novel is not without comedy, and rather interesting comedy at times, there's a kind of knockabout comedy in the early stages of the film where you see Nick coming to New York for the first time, which is absolutely contrary to the spirit of the novel. It's just, he makes Carraway into this sort of, frog-faced doofus, and it's just not, it isn't, it's no Carraway that I've ever imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that framing device of the rehab story, again, for me, is a very, very very 2013 decision. And as you say, to see the novel as itself a kind of therapeutic act, that seems to me awash with our ideas about illness, about alcohol, about, the fact that, but it's weird, but it makes a nonsense of some of the lines that they keep, because then Nick says at one point in the narration, I've only been drunk twice in my life, and I'm sitting thinking, well, then why are you in rehab? I'm pretty sure you don't have to freak out yet. You should be drunk at least 3 times before you go into rehab. I'm reasonably confident. So the thing is I think that whole need to medicalize it, and as you say, I think you're right that they're conflating it with Fitzgerald. But of course, Fitzgerald was in total denial. Fitzgerald never went into rehab. Fitzgerald never admitted that he had a drinking problem. He had one of the 20th century's great legendary drinking problems, but he absolutely never admitted that. And so this whole notion would have been anathema to him and to his vision of the novel. And again, as I say, I just find that a very 2013 attitude to take. They even play Amy Winehouse in the soundtrack. Although at least it's not rehab, at least it's Back to Black. But they put Back to Black in the soundtrack. I know, I couldn't believe it.
The rapper, Jay-Z, is on the soundtrack. So they're not worried about anachronistic music, that's for sure. One of the things that you said, Sarah, was about what the novel has to say about America. And I think one of the interesting things about Gatsby is that it wasn't a success in its time. Fitzgerald made $2.10 out in royalties, I believe.
In the last year of his life. At the beginning, he made a little bit of money.
Right.
But.
But it wasn't a huge success, and maybe that's because its observation about America was ahead of its time. In other words, that he was so shrewd about the state of the nation around him that the people who were also living it with him couldn't see it yet. Do you think? Why would you say, Kevin? I'm going to start with you. Why do you think it wasn't a success at the time?
Can I put it in a bigger context by saying that sales, it's extraordinary fact that the books we're talking about, which now seem to be absolutely constitutive of their age, sold in figures that contemporary publishers would slit their throats at. The first edition of The Wasteland in England sold 800 copies, and actually not even quite that, but 800 was the print run. That's about how many it sold. The first edition of Ulysses was 1,000 copies. I don't know what the print run on.
It was 20,000 and then 3,000 in the first year, so 23,000 in the first year.
But I mean, in the case of Joyce and Eliot, we're talking about microscopic sales. In the case of
Fitzgerald was a very popular writer.
Yeah, indeed he was. Yeah, so that it's an interesting case of how. It's a very weird thing which has happened again and again in the culture of the last 200 years, where minority tastes translate via the academy usually into canonical texts. I mean, the fact is that it would have been very easily, number one, certainly neither The Wasteland or Ulysses might not ever have been published, and number two, they might have just disappeared. And it is a very interesting but a slightly different story from the one I tell as to why they found their way into the state they currently enjoy, which is in fact very much to do, number one, with the advocacy of brilliant critics like Edmund Wilson, who of course was crucial in keeping alive Fitzgerald's reputation, and I think in about the late 1940s, in reviving it, because Gatsby had become almost forgotten, I believe, hadn't it? And that you have to, I mean, critics get a really bad name, but Wilson was really a fantastically interesting writer in his own right. I strongly believe, I don't know whether you agree with me, that without Wilson's intervention, Gatsby would probably be forgotten now. He saw in it things that nobody else had seen, and he spoke up hard for them, and people listened eventually.
One of the things you point out in your book is that although Gatsby was actually published in 1925, it's set in 1922, and Fitzgerald wrote about the significance of that particular year. Now, it was partly these literary publications that we're talking about that made it significant, but it was also the first year of radio and fax. It was about a sort of explosion of marketing and media and publicity and so on.
It's the UC year of Walter Lippmann's Public Relations, which is one of the kind of great canonical texts in a different field about the whole modern industry. PR was born in 1922.
One of the things that I found as I was working on the book was I started trying to get back to first principles. For me as a literary critic is always going to be language, and get back to the language. And one of the ways to do that was to try to figure out what words had actually started to emerge in this moment. And I found what I think is an absolutely extraordinary list. It really surprised me, and then I thought, and what surprised me afterwards was that I was sure my editor was going to make me cut it. So what happened was I compiled this list of words that were first coined between 1918 and 1923, and every one of them I thought was a surprise, and I'll tell you a couple of them in a second. And it was it was in the draft of the first chapter, and I gave it to my editor, and I thought, well, that was fun. And now she's going to say, well, that's nice, Sarah, but I think that's for a piece of journalism or for a scholarly article or something, but it has nothing to do with this book because it's not about Scott Fitzgerald and it's not about this murder mystery. And she read it and she said, "This is great. I think you need to do more of this. I think this is exactly, what this is about, is trying to find what is specific to this moment, but also weirdly parallels today," which is one of the subtexts of my book, is how much of what's happening there is actually happening today. So for example, a word first coined in that period between 1918 and 1923, post-feminist, first used in that moment. Mass media, mass market, both coined there. Broadcasting coined there because of the coming of radio. A lot of publicity words because of the coming of public relations. So publicity hound and actually celebrity stalker. The OED gives the earliest use of celebrity stalker from the 1980s, and I found one in 1923. Thank you very much. I've got to email the OED in my full geek, professor mode and be like, "I found it, pedant. I found an earlier one."
The example that I loved was that Scott Fitzgerald is the first person to use wicked as
a compliment. As a compliment.
Although that's, speaking as a part-time resident in Maine, wicked has always meant good in Maine.
Has it always meant? No, I think since 1920.
Okay, fair enough.
So in This Side of Paradise, in Fitzgerald's first novel, well, he's not the first to coin it. He's the first to record it. So it's a popular slang term. But the thing is, and also the word party as a verb is first coined by the poet E.E. Cummings at the end of 1922. That's the earliest recording that we have. So if you said, "We were partying last night and it was wicked," that is not 2012, that is 1920, 1922. And but also some of the banking terms, that are subprime, is from the 1920s. Arbitrage is from merchant bank, first coined in the 1920s. Ponzi scheme, because the first Ponzi scheme was in the 1920s, which is one of the things that I detail in the book.
The EFG Bank is one of our sponsors today.
Thanks, guys.
I'm sure would never, ever do anything like that.
I shall now read Canto 45. Well, I was very interested in my very early researches into Ezra Pound to discover that at the turn of the first 20 years of the 20th century, the word sexist, by which we now mean supporter of the patriarchy, used to mean a believer in free love.
I did not know
that. A sexist
that.
was somebody who believed in free love.
That's a good one. See, I love stuff like that.
Some of the languages you talked about in this explosion of language that happened partly because of an explosion in the media in 1922, I thought there were words in there that were things we would associate with 1922. There was a wonderful list of the favourite adjectives of the year of Zelda and Scott. Hectic, delirious, marvellous, slick, and killing.
Yeah.
And those do sound like something that we would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I love slick. And that was a really big one in 1922. Both Scott and Zelda kept writing letters where they would, write to an editor and say, "Thank you for the slick party." I know you can't imagine, it's very, very dated, but I think in a kind of wonderful way. And one of the other things, speaking of Edmund Wilson, one of the things that Edmund Wilson did, because he was a journalist, so he wasn't just especially later in life, he became the real kind of eminence grise of American letters, but early in life, he's a jobbing journalist, and he was doing all kinds of different things, and he was writing for Vanity Fair. He was editing Vanity Fair as well, but he compiled in 1927 a list that he called A Lexicon of Prohibition. And it was a list of all the contemporary terms for being drunk, starting from the least, I forget how he puts it, but basically from the least strong, and working his way up through gradations to the end. And they're not those words, because they're all words that were current in the 1920s. They're not all necessarily coined in the 1920s. He wasn't trying to find the new words. He was just trying to find the words that were, so things like plastered, which is very old, was in his list. But there are some new ones, like jazzed, which we might like in the for the jazz age, that to be drunk was to be jazzed. Owled. Lit was a very big one. To have an edge. He had acquired, this actually in This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald uses this, and my students are sometimes very confused by it. He had acquired a fine, distinguished edge, and what that means is he's loaded. And so I love the idea of Wilson very solemnly writing down all of these terms for drunk.
1922 was also, of course, the glory age of the flapper, and that year there was a famous front cover of Life magazine, which was a beautiful picture of. I like it unironically as well as ironically, which just shows a 1922 style young woman as a giant butterfly.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful image.
You can get it on Google.
But there's also somebody that year, a woman called Ella Hartung, published a short book called A Flapper's Dictionary, and it was a list of all the slang that flappers use, where you find words like snuggle puppy. Yeah. Apparently, he was a young man who likes to attend petting parties. There's lots of very good stuff.
That was the amazing thing, because as Kevin said, that when we both heard last year that each other was working on this book on
those
1922,
screams emitting from
exactly, hearts sink, and you just think, oh my God, I can't believe I've just been pipped to the post, and this close to it as well. And then you realize, okay, and then, you realize that we both actually done something very different, and then actually read each other's books, and lo and behold, we both have lists of slang, but different lists of slang. And so in this really weird way, there are these very, very strong parallels in the material that keeps coming out, but almost no redundancy.
I actually have several murders in my book.
You do?
Including, there's a very famous murder that happens on the same day that Ulysses is published, February the 2nd. And it's the murder which eventually echoes down the years and with several kind of distorted impressions becomes the story for Sunset Boulevard. Yeah. And that was of a murder that happened in Hollywood the very day that Ulysses was published. And I speak of another murder mystery in England towards the end of the year. It's a very famous case where a woman who'd been having an affair with a younger man was involved in, the younger man killed her husband, and there was a question about to what extent she was culpable for this, to what extent she'd arranged it. And in fact, the trial was held, and it was an enormous popular sensation, and actually the verdict went against her. And very interestingly, my main guys, Eliot and Joyce, both commented on it in a way that reveals a lot about their personalities. Joyce said it was an appalling miscarriage of justice, and that he really wished that this woman had not been hanged. She was hanged for the offence. Eliot thought her being hanged was a thoroughly good idea, and he wrote letters to the Daily Mail commending them for their stern moral stance on this. So that's quite an interesting way of playing Eliot and Joyce off against each other.
Eliot, of course, was also interested in murders, because there are references in Sweeney Agonisti's The Gallon of Lysol in a Bath.
Anyone do a girl in, Do a girl in, yes, and there's the famous. He never republished this, but he wrote 2 short stories called Eeldrop and Appleplex, which are about these guys who are obviously based on Eliot and Pound going to meet together and discussing the nature of murder.
Yes.
They're incredibly sinister. Eliot is far more sinister than people do credit for.
So it's really, really creepy.
Tell us a bit more about this, the whole...
About my murder. Well, before I do that, I want to say the William Desmond Taylor murder, which is the one that happens on the day that Ulysses is published. The thing that I thought was really amazing about that, so then I started looking into that too, is this thing, we're overlapping but then kind of diverging again, that looking at William Desmond Taylor, it turns out that that wasn't his name, and that he actually changed his name, abandoned his family, and went off to Hollywood to try to climb the social ladder. So for me, he actually becomes this kind of little miniature Gatsby figure because he gives himself a grander name.
Yes.
He was born William Dean Tanner or something like that, and he becomes William Desmond Taylor, which is a kind of Gatsby.
And of course, the name Desmond becomes an echo in the name Norma Desmond, who's the faded diva in Sunset.
And Gloria Swanson is in the Great Gatsby.
Is in the Great Gatsby, and
it all works.
I mean, this is astonishing. And one of the things that came out, as I've said a couple of times, meeting Sarah before, is this extraordinary 1 degree of separation thing. That once you start focusing on 3 or 4 or 5 key people and you follow their stories through, you suddenly realise that they are always about one handshake away from somebody else really important in the story.
Yeah.
Be it Mussolini, be it Einstein, be it Keynes, you name it. They're always very close.
We'll come to some of the people who might be connected with this place who mentioned in a moment. But tell me first about the Hall murder.
So the Har Mills murder happened in the murder itself occurred on September 14th, 1922. So mid-September. And it was in New Brunswick, as I mentioned, which is a town about 50 miles outside of New York in New Jersey. And which was at that time a very small town. It was quiet, very middle class. Everybody was sort of behaving themselves. And then there was this enormous scandal because this minister, he was an Episcopalian, Anglican minister, disappeared from his home the night of Thursday, September 14th, and he was married, and the also married woman who sang in his choir, named Eleanor Mills, also disappeared at the same time. And for 2 days, their spouses were looking for them, their families were looking for them, and on the morning of that Saturday, the 16th, their bodies were discovered in a field outside of town, both shot through the head. What was really extraordinary about it, though, was that they had been laid out in the field, the New York Times said, as if for burial. And so the bodies had been staged very carefully. And his hand was under her head. Her hand, and this is 1922, remember, her hand is resting intimately and very suggestively on his thigh. And their love letters were scattered around the bodies. And his calling card was propped against his shoe, one might think, so that he could be easily identified. So I'll tell you my favorite, and it will give you a flavor of what happens with the investigation into this murder. So you might wonder why the bodies were staged this way, and so did the authorities investigating the murder, and they couldn't really work it out. And they concluded within about a week that it must have meant that there was a woman involved in the killings, that there must have been a woman culprit, because only a woman would lay out the bodies so neatly and attractively in a field.
Quite right.
Seriously. I kid you not. This is what they concluded. So they said there must have been a woman there because, obviously men, will leave the bodies any old which way, but only women will be very, very neat and precise about, and it seems literally not to have occurred to the authorities that there might have been another message beyond, creating a pleasing aesthetic tableau for the community. So what happens is this story becomes absolutely insane because the authorities are unbelievably incompetent. I mean, it's a Keystone Cops scenario, and I wouldn't tell you, some of it is just, they miss all kinds of things like bullets in her face that you wouldn't think that they could miss. I'm not even making this up, and I'm not exaggerating.
That is the best point, I think.
It's just
the
extraordinary.
Coroner misses a bullet in the head.
The coroner misses 2 bullets full in the face. He also, I don't want to give too much away, but he also misses some other things that you would think it would be really, 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 really hard to miss. However, he did not neglect to check whether she was pregnant. So he cuts open her abdomen to make sure she's not pregnant, but he misses the bullet holes in her face. I mean, my favorite bit of that part, though, is that when this all starts to come out, they say there were no coroners or medical examiners rather. At that time, New York had just appointed the first medical examiner in 1918, and 4 years later, the mayor's office in New York City was still complaining basically about having to pay for this medical examiner guy because who needs that? And so, for most local places, the duty of inspecting any bodies fell to the responsibility of a county coroner's physician. And so, in this case, there's this kind of just this county GP, basically. And he came along, and it turned out that he never really did a proper autopsy on the body, which was how he managed to miss the bullet holes in the face. And there's this great quotation that I love where, so finally there's some pressure on them saying, well, why didn't you perform an autopsy? And he said, well, it was obvious they'd been murdered, and that was all there was to it. Like, why do an autopsy? They'd been murdered. What else do you need to know?
And in the coverage that went on for months afterwards, there were themes and issues that seemed to have found their way into the ethos of Gatsby.
Well, that's what I'm trying to suggest. I mean, it's a very delicate thing here because, as I said, first of all, it's a narrative. I'm not writing an academic argument, and I don't want to argue something here. I want to try to. One of the things I say in the introduction is that what I wanted to try to do was to suggest how inspiration might have worked. So it's a speculative kind of a thing, and I don't want to press it too hard because there is no hard evidence that Scott Fitzgerald was consciously thinking about this murder when he was working on The Great Gatsby.
But you can
that
find
said,
echoes.
There are many strong echoes, and I do have evidence. I won't tell you what it is because for me it's one of the climactic moments in the book. It's something that the story builds up to. Is the question of whether Scott Fitzgerald was following the case. So there is. It's not purely speculative, but the role that this murder may or may not have played in the novel is necessarily interpretive. And so I wanted to keep that suggestive and let it kind of let readers basically draw their own conclusions. But for me, the parallels become very, 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 very strong. And it seems clear to me that that 2 of the characters who emerge from this murder mystery, I think, are models for 2 of the characters in Gatsby.
Great. We'll have to read the rest to find out the gripping story. I'm going to ask Kevin a couple of things before I give you a chance to ask some questions of your own. I just want to come back to this whole idea of the birth of modernism, which is the critical thing about your book, about Constellation of Genius. Some people would argue that, in fact, modernism started a lot earlier. I mean,
Page 2 of my book.
You do say so.
Exhausts all of this, yes.
You do say
do you want me to recapitulate it?
Well, indeed. I mean, you could go right back to, Flaubert and Les Fleurs du Mal and so on.
Well,
go back
funny
to
you say that. That's exactly where I do go back to.
Exactly. So we're using this idea of 1922 as a sort of pivot, partly because of Pound's sense of the new starting.
Pound called 1922 Modernism Year One, which is where the title
Modernism
comes from.
Year One, exactly. But in fact, we know from here that there were things already going on. Wyndham Lewis, the Futurists, Picasso, Braque. There's evidence in the house that we've just looked around of modernists, things we would describe as modernists, that were produced earlier in the 20th century, slightly earlier than 1922. So, first of all, well, you've said it. You do take account of this in the book. You do go back, but tell us a little bit about what the Bloomsbury Circle, how they fit into this picture of modernism, because some of the characters are mentioned in your diary of what they were up to.
I think a quick way to begin that is to talk about Virginia Woolf's contrasting attitude towards Eliot and towards Joyce. Eliot she admired very much, and in some of the narrative of the early months of the book is she hears him reading The Wasteland for the first time and is absolutely blown away with it. And clearly admired him very much. I want to talk about a rather interesting thing about Anglo-American mythology here, in that when Eliot first began to court Vivian, his first wife, his poor first wife, that there were lots of thoughts about how appalling it was that this full-blooded, robust, outgoing, magnificent English woman was being mated to this American milquetoast, who, as I think it was Ottilie Morel who said something like, Eliot is coming round on Thursday in his four-piece suit, meaning that he wore tweed underwear. And I grew up, I think, with the national stereotype that Englishmen were effete, homosexual, completely true, communist, sexless geeks, and that America represented robustness, masculinity, blah blah blah. Well, in the mythology, the pre-First World War mythology of Mounts Bertrand Russell and the other Bloomsburys, it was exactly the opposite. That the English were considered to be the robust and sexual creatures, and the Americans. And we actually, when they look at Eliot, with some justice here, because it's to me no means clear that they ever consummated their marriage. I have a hunch not. There was that sort of reverse from our day's mythology about the respective sexuality of the nations went in the entire opposite direction. The myth was that it was Americans who were sexless. So there's that whole thing about how Eliot is a presence that is very prickly and very pompous and very disapproved of by Bloomsbury, but gradually is accepted because of his obvious genius. Conversely, when Woolf starts to read Joyce, she's initially thinks it's all right. Then she becomes more and more disgusted, and in fact, her attitudes, I think, perhaps, certainly from my point of view, and perhaps this is because I'm resentful, she regards him as a sort of an ill-bred, pimply Dublin slum dweller whose work is simply disgusting, and so she divides herself between, on the one hand, immensely admiring one of my two main characters, Eliot, and absolutely despising the other main character, Joyce. Now that's very interesting. She also, of course, is implicated in. She's profoundly. I'm told that sometimes she could be profoundly generous towards Catherine Mansfield, but the particular bits that I focused on is, number one, her seething anger at the fact that The Garden Party comes out before her own novel that year and gets rave reviews, and she's absolutely convulsed with envy and rage about that. But then there are much more. I mean, basically what I'm saying is I'm very ambivalent about her. I don't know really anymore what I think of her. That she seems on the one hand so perceptive. She's brilliant on Proust, who died in 1922, but it was kind of one of his, despite the fact that he died, it was actually a great year for him in every other respect. Fantastic career move. She's brilliantly perceptive about Proust, but I think she just gets Joyce absolutely wrong, and I don't know why, and I still don't know why. One day.
But it brings us back to where we started, actually, that one of the not very credible moments in the Baz Luhrmann film of Gatsby has Nick Carraway reading Ulysses, with a copy of Ulysses, which, considering there were only 800 copies out there, he was sort of not literary enough to...
Well, but exactly, well, this question about Nick Carraway, right? Because Scott Fitzgerald did have a copy of Ulysses that summer, which Edmund Wilson was the one who told him where to get it. And he got it from a bookshop called the Brick Row Bookshop, where you could get contraband books, and he had it sent to him in the Midwest. So I think Luhrmann has done his research. Yeah. There's no question. I just think most of the time he disregarded it. Yeah. And no, I mean, I'm serious. Yes. I'm not even being facetious. I think that because things like, it's one of the things I talk about in the book, in 1922, women's dresses are ankle length, they're not knee length. Yes. And he absolutely did the research into costumes to know that. But and that's what I meant when I said that he's doing our myths about the novel, not what actually would have been happening in 1922, because the dresses are knee length, which is what all of us would expect. We wouldn't expect them to be ankle length, but actually they ought to be ankle length. I think that he probably did do the research to find that Scott Fitzgerald had Ulysses in July 1922, and that's part of what Kevin was talking about, that conflation of Nick and Fitzgerald.
The subscription list to Ulysses is fascinating because it includes T. Lawrence of Arabia, Arabia and Winston Churchill. It's just amazing.
I'm going to give you a chance to ask a few questions. We have some, yes, there's a gentleman over there, very quick. Thank you.
It's the jazz age. We haven't talked about music.
Yeah.
I would love to hear your comments on how the energy of the music influenced these people and the age. Also, perhaps how the energy of the pentameters of the music influenced the literature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an excellent point, and it's only because we could keep doing this for hours, and there's so much to talk about here as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, Fitzgerald always took credit for coining the phrase "the Jazz Age," and his novel, short story collection "Tales of the Jazz Age" comes out this same autumn, the autumn of 1922, September 22nd. In Gatsby, there's a famous scene in Gatsby's first party scene, the second party scene in the novel, which comes in chapter 3, which is the famous one that everybody remembers, about the men and girls who came and went like whisperings, like moths among the whisperings in the champagne and the stars. And that's the one where the composer Tostoff announces that he's doing a jazz history of the world. And it's clearly and yes, that was a rude pun that Fitzgerald was doing deliberately, Mr. Tostoff. It is, as Kevin said, it is a novel that also has.
You have a filthy mind.
I know. I'm so sorry. It is a novel that when you go back to it has much more humor in it. That would be another theme that we could pick up on is also the humor in all of this, because we tend to approach it very piously and reverently. One of the things that Fitzgerald did in one of the early drafts of Gatsby was actually try to describe a jazz composition. He actually ended up cutting it from the final version, and he only does a kind of quick reference to it. But he's clearly there referring to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which is actually one of the moments that Luhrmann does get right, because he brings Rhapsody in Blue in. And Rhapsody in Blue, as I'm sure you all know, premiered in February 1924, just before Scott and Zelda sailed for France, where he would go and write the novel.
Gershwin's first jazz opera did premiere in 1922.
In 1922, and Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. Scott and Zelda always went to hear at the Palais Royal. So again, it's these points of conversion, and Fitzgerald absolutely is one of the first American popular writers to bring a soundtrack into the novel, to bring music in.
But there was this other question, the suggestion that the music actually influenced the rhythms of the language.
Well, there are a couple of things there. There's one, as you correctly point out in your book, there's the famous phrase in The Wasteland, oh, that Shakespearean rag. People wrongly think of Eliot as being someone who's only interested in high culture. He was the same year Mary Lloyd, the English musical singer, dies, and he writes this magnificent essay about her talent, and he was profoundly and unsnobbishly and uncondescendingly interested in music hall. He wrote an essay about I think it was anthropology, called Charleston Hey Hey at one point. The thing I really want to make, and I stand under Sarah's advice here, but I have the impression that the jazz that Scott and Zelda listened to was mostly Paul Whiteman, the appropriately named Paul Whiteman, who was known as the king of jazz, but he was white. And of course, the great genius of jazz that emerged in 1922 was Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, who in the middle of the year takes the train from his native New Orleans to go to Chicago to join the band, with which he first becomes famous and then rapidly nationally famous and then rapidly internationally famous. Unfortunately, he didn't record any of these things until 1923. So it's unfortunately, I would have loved this evening to play some of his Chicago
I would have loved to have heard it.
Tunes from 1922, but they just don't exist. You know,
do you think you can hear it in the prose?
I would have said that I don't think that Fitzgerald knew much about black jazz, do you?
No, he
Which,
didn't.
to our perspective, is real jazz.
Yeah, I think you can to a certain extent. I think you can hear popular music in it, and popular music then was jazzy, and so that is coming into it. But I don't think for me anyway, that Fitzgerald is that much. He is an experimental writer, but he's not an experimental writer in that mode. And it's going to take somebody like Ralph Ellison to really do that, to really consciously write a jazz novel and try to think about what that would mean. And so Invisible Man, is classically the great American jazz novel. I think that it inflects the language in certain ways. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to hear pentameter there, although I mean I can certainly go back and give it another crack. I will say though that the other thing we haven't mentioned in this context, which is in a sense the elephant in this room, which is the Charleston, and the Charleston never appears in The Great Gatsby, which is something that people tend not to notice because we just assume that they're Charlestoning their way from one side of the party to the other. In point of fact, they're not. As I say, first of all, the word never appears in the novel and the dance never appears in the novel. But there's a very good reason for that, which is that the Charleston did not become, although we could certainly be playing it, but it did not become a popular dance until after The Great Gatsby was published. It was actually the end of the summer of 1925.
Well, I noticed last week, one of the broadsheets had a subheadline which says something like, "As The Great Gatsby, Lindy hops its way into success." Lindy Hop is 1928, man!
Wrong, totally wrong. Hopeless, hopeless, hopeless.
Any more questions? Yes, lady in the front there. Just wait for the mic 1 second. There it is.
You haven't mentioned the effect of prohibition at all.
Yes.
On the novel.
Well, this is gin, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. Look, there is. We haven't mentioned it yet again, just because I think there are so many themes here that you could pick up on. It's certainly a major theme and aspect in my book. It had to be exactly as you say. Yes. In terms of its effect on the novel, well, Gatsby is a bootlegger. So and understanding what that means, the parallel that I usually draw with today is that I think the closest we could come to understanding how that would work is basically he's like a drug dealer.
Mm-hmm.
So in a cosmopolitan, sophisticated context in which lots of people take recreational drugs, or indeed everybody takes recreational drugs, right? So if you imagine a Jay McInerney novel, Bright Lights, Big City, everybody, quote unquote, is taking cocaine at those parties. And of course, McInerney is a huge Gatsby fan, and he's rewriting Gatsby in important ways in that novel. But if you are a high society woman, will you run off with your drug dealer? Maybe not. And it's very easy to criticize Daisy, and I am, as we said at the beginning, she's inadequate in important kinds of ways. But also, Gatsby is doing something that is illegal and is literally beyond the pale. It is not acceptable what he's doing. So it's acceptable for them to be drinking, but it is not acceptable for him to be bootlegging. And it's that distinction that the novel is trading out. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do in my research very quickly was just understand more about how Prohibition actually worked, again, to get away from our myths about it and try to learn more about how it actually functioned. One of the things that I found that I'm very proud of, I found in the archives, is Scott Fitzgerald's handwritten recipe for bathtub gin. So it's in here, so you can actually find out how they actually made bathtub gin, and it's not moonshine. So they weren't making gin from potatoes or whatever. They were starting with grain alcohol and they were diluting it and flavoring it, and that's what they meant by bathtub gin. And so you can get the recipe here. But the other thing that I found out about Prohibition that really interested me, because again, I had a lot of the same myths and received wisdom because they've come down to all of us, was that idea of people going to speakeasies and having to know the password. Mm-hmm. But they didn't use passwords. And once you start to think about it, you realize there's a very good reason why they wouldn't use passwords, which is that they're all really drunk, and so they wouldn't remember them. So they didn't use passwords. They almost never did. All you would do is you might ask for a name. You'd ask for Steve or something if you knew. But what they used was business cards. They called them bootleggers' cards or speakeasy cards, and they were basically like pass cards. They were like club membership cards, and and that's how you would get in. And the New York Historical Society actually has an amazing collection of these bootleggers and speakeasy cards. And so there are accounts from a lot of the people who are contemporaries of Fitzgerald's of you'd walk around if you were a woman, with a purse, bulging with these cards that you were supposed to have so that you could get into any of the bars that you wanted to go to. And Fitzgerald actually kept a few of his bootleggers' cards among his papers, so we can find some of the places that he went to.
When you're talking about Daisy and the bootlegger, you also bring up one of the other things that we haven't touched upon, which is the theme of class. And one of the issues about Gatsby is that he may be rich, but he's also vulgar, because he wears a pink suit and he wears a silver shirt and a gold tie. And Tom Buchanan, although when we don't sympathise with him, identifies this about Gatsby, that he's Mr. Nobody from nowhere.
Yeah, an Oxford man like Eliot, he wears a pink suit. I didn't go to Oxford. Are you kidding me?
We could expand on that, or we might just take another question.
There's lots of class in your book as well.
Perhaps we'll let this gentleman ask a question.
I think I can carry.
Oh yes, go for it.
I'm awfully sorry, I've forgotten the name of the academic.
Sarah.
Sarah.
No.
Oh.
Sarah.
Well, you can.
I've just read a paperback with the introduction and notes by an academic.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, we can't hear you.
So you do go for it.
Sorry. He suggests that the great in Gatsby
was consciously ironic, and that Gatsby himself, not Gatsby, Fitzgerald expressed some dismay that nobody had taken that on board. Do you agree with that?
Well, he never expressed any dismay about that, to my knowledge. Certainly not in any of his letters. He was very uncertain about what he wanted to call the novel, and what he did express dismay about was that he was worried when they went with The Great Gatsby that he had not put enough in the novel about how to read that greatness and about making it ironic. So basically, what he said was, I'm worried that people won't get it because I didn't put anything in the novel about, or didn't put enough in the novel about ironizing it. So it was more preemptive than actually expressing dismay that they missed the point later on. But yes, I think it certainly is. It like much of the novel, I think that it's ambivalent. It's both ways, and that's why I think it's such a rich novel. Gatsby is great, and Nick is very specific about what makes him great in the opening pages of the novel, which is his capacity for hope. And Nick then links that at the end of the novel to mankind's capacity for wonder. So for me, this is a novel about capacity. It's about possibility. And that is Gatsby's greatness. But Gatsby is also not great. And because he's a bootlegger, and because he's vulgar, and because of his limitations, because he fixes on the wrong woman, because of all kinds of because he's materialistic, because of all kinds of mistakes that he makes.
Because he's really Gats.
Because he's really Gats, because he's a fake. So he's also not great. And so I think that it's that double-edged meaning, that kind of irony, that kind of it's almost a narrative irony. It's almost a proper kind of classical dramatic irony, that this meaning cuts both ways. And I think a lot of the emotional power of the book comes from the fact that a lot of those sorts of value systems cut both ways.
I agree with every word of that, but I just want to cap it by saying something which stuck in my brain and has stuck for many years, that I was lucky enough to be taught by a critic called Christopher Ricks, and one of the things that he told me when I was 20 and fantastically stupid is that the difference between sarcasm and irony is that sarcasm cuts one way, so it means the opposite. The Great Gatsby means, the rubbish Gatsby, and irony works two ways. It means both the Great Gatsby and the Great Gatsby, and I think that it's an ironic title in the Ricksian sense.
Absolutely.
And of course, the book had several alternative titles before it was The Great Gatsby. Tell us about those, Kevin.
Yeah.
Well, Trimalchio at West Egg, isn't it? Is the most obvious one, because there's an interesting, and I think, no, maybe not so accidental, link between The Wasteland and this is that the epigraph, not accidental, the epigraph to The Wasteland is from Petronius's Satyricon, and you'll remember that the Satyricon is presided over by this vulgarian former slave who holds this massive, excessive banquet, and his name is Trimalchio. And one of the draft titles, I understand, Sarah knows vastly more about this than I do, was Trimalchio at West Egg?
In West Egg, that's one of them. And then one of the things that I trace through in the novel is that because there was this scholarly article that was written a few years ago by somebody talking about how Fitzgerald, because when he was at Princeton, and it was basically one of these nostalgic articles that says back in the good old days people used to get a classical education at Princeton, and so of course Fitzgerald knew Latin, and therefore he knew his Petronius and he knew his Trimalchio, and that's why he makes this reference to Trimalchio. It's a nice story, particularly if you like Fitzgerald. It has the disadvantage of being untrue. Because Fitzgerald flunked Latin 3 times at Princeton. It's one of the reasons why he got kicked out. And he was a marginal classicist at best. But in the autumn of 1922, in America, there was a big news story about a new translation of Trimalchio, of Petronius, they were trying to get it censored on the grounds that it was obscene. And there's actually some very funny, so he didn't have to read Latin, he just had to read the New York Times, is one of the things I say in the book, to know about the meaning of Trimalchio. But the other possible titles for the novel were, he tried The Gold-Hatted Gatsby, The High-Bouncing Lover. He thought all of those were too light. I think we can probably all agree with that. And then at the very last minute, he was really vacillating about the title, and he wasn't happy with any of them. And then at the very last minute, he cabled his editor and said, I want to call it crazy about the title, Under the Red, White, and Blue. And is it too late for that? And Perkins said it was too late. And nobody knows whether it really was too late or whether Perkins just thought that was a rubbish title and wanted to stick with The Great Gatsby. But one of the things that I think about that title, which is probably not a great title, but it would have had the advantage of pointing out to its original readers that this was a novel about America, which most of them missed. Yeah. And most of them thought it was just this story of Long Island society. And that was to go back to your very early question about the novel not succeeding and the reasons for that. I think that's one of the reasons for it, was that they just didn't see the broader points that
people
he was
took
trying
it to be a
make.
melodrama, didn't they? Really,
Yeah.
rather than something which has a melodramatic element, but actually then transcends its.
Well, what they took it to be was a story ripped from the headlines, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and look at those headlines. Indeed, a fait divers, as Edith Wharton very dismissively said. And so the question then of why they would think that, in a sense, my whole book sets out to answer that question of why would they think that. And when you go back and look at the headlines, you can see why they would. And it struck me as I was working on this that it would be a little bit like, so there are these tabloid figures that everybody's familiar with, and this tabloid melodramatic story about affairs, and there's this murder at the end, and I thought, these are stories that they're reading about every day in the papers, and it's a little bit as if, imagine somebody writing a novel today about footballers' wives and it being a masterpiece. We just wouldn't be able to see it. We would absolutely not be able to see, because we would be so trapped in the presumptive vulgarity of these characters, their presumptive triviality. It would never occur to us that you could take this seriously as a work of art. And that's the closest analogy that I can draw, I think, to why these are just idiot tabloid characters. I read about these every day. This can't be a masterpiece. It's not possible.
Perhaps you could fit one last question in. That would be quite nice to end on the word masterpiece.
Actually, we ended on the word possible if we do that, which is what the novel's about.
Well, perhaps we are going to end on the word masterpiece, because we don't have any... Oh, no, there's one brave person here going to ask a final question. Thank you.
Do I just speak into this?
Yes, stand up if you'd like to. Thank you.
I just wondered whether the focus this evening on 1922 somehow means that we forget that there are more universal messages in Gatsby, and you've touched on that in your last answer. The things about the outsider, the person who doesn't conform to the norms of proper society, class, which actually can be applied any place, any time almost. In fact, the last time I read Gatsby was when the Rebecca Brooke trial was on, and I saw Rebecca Brooke as Gatsby and sort of thought, where did all her friends go?
Yes, why it's an enduring masterpiece, perhaps, is because there are in fact themes that transcend 1922. Kevin, would you like to comment on that?
I think all of the books that I write about transcend not only 1922 but the 20th century. They're part of European civilization going back about 3,000 years, and they incorporate. Ulysses is called Ulysses because it looks back to obviously to Homer. The wasteland is absolutely saturated. It goes back even further than the Greeks. It ends, da diadvam damiata, give, sympathize, control. It goes back to the Indo-European roots of our very language. So no, I think these books are, the two books I'm talking about certainly are eternal books, and certainly not. The fact that they are products of a particular cultural moment doesn't mean that they are confined to that cultural moment.
And what is it you think about Gatsby that's enduring?
Oh, everything, all the things you said, and then so many other things. As with Kevin, I wouldn't be talking about this book if it hadn't transcended its moment. That's the point. And I think that, probably everybody in this room has, I made a joke earlier about spoiling it, because I'm assuming that most people in this room have read the novel at some point or other, or if not, your children are reading it for GCSEs or what have you. People have connections with this novel precisely because so many of its meanings are about, as I said earlier, about hope, about possibility, about our capacity. It's a novel about optimism. It's a novel about illusion and disillusionment. I can go on and on. It's about class. It's about power. It's about status. It's about, and it is about love. It's just about Gatsby's love, not about Daisy's love. I just think that's an important, point to make about it. But for me, the reason for kind of going back to 1922 is to say that those. I don't want to be dismissive about those universal meanings at all, but for me, I think for many readers today, those are the familiar meanings. Those are the ones that we encounter. They're the ones we encounter in the classroom. They're the ones we encounter when we read the novel ourselves. That's what we connect with. And what happens then is that we've lost the other half of it. And then one of the questions that then is raised is a bafflement about how readers could have missed this in the first place when it seems to be this universal story. And so in a sense, I was trying to understand that, but also, as Kevin said a moment ago, to understand the moment that produced it and say that for me, what makes this novel great, really great, is that it does both. And it is this incredible, incredible document about a moment that just paints an impressionistic picture of a moment in time that we then have overlaid with all kinds of myths and misapprehensions, and I kind of wanted to strip those back so that we could see the picture that Fitzgerald paints. But none of that changes that larger point about the meaning and the profundity of the novel and its endurance, and I certainly think it will endure throughout the 21st century, I don't think there's any question about that, are because of those larger meanings, not because of how prohibition works in the novel, for example.
And after all, when we look at the titles of your books, Careless People still exist. Constellations of Genius, if it's about genius, it's likely to last. Both these books will be sold in the bookshop afterwards. Thank you so much for listening, for your wonderful questions. And thank you hugely. Oh, sorry, I believe there's another thank you going over there. Thank you to Sarah and to Kevin for their illuminating observations about both this novel and its moment. Thank you.